Well, here we go for week 51. We are almost to the end. Now, this week we really tackle a number of books. So we finished the book of James. We read 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, Jude, and then begin Revelation. Now, you may say, hey, are we making this big push at the end and we're adding more reading? No, the reading stays the same. We're just working our way through a number of books. And the reason for that is many of these books are very short. And that's one of the things I find exciting in our reading this week. Often these books are not read, particularly Jude and 2nd and 3rd John and 2nd Peter. So I'm excited for you to become a little more familiar with them, and I think you'll find them very helpful. Now, believers throughout all the ages and in the church age have always faced kind of two big issues, and that is of persecution and hostility for their faith and false teachers. And when we get to our reading this week, we see this kind of really front and center. So when we get to the book of 1 Peter, this is a very relevant book for us today because Peter is writing to these believers who are really facing hostility for their faith. Now, there's some disagreement about how intense the persecution and hostility was. I kind of lean more toward these believers were being mocked for their faith, ridiculed at times. They were just facing hostility maybe when it came to their workplace. And so I think that is very relevant to us today. Our culture, as it kind of drifts further and further away from Christian values, we are beginning to face more hostility. Our kids in high school, for example, are facing this hostility and having to really face it day after day. And so I think you'll find 1 Peter a very relevant and helpful book of how do you live out your faith publicly when that hostility is there. Now, the other issue is that of false teaching. And so we see this some with 2 Peter. It's called out in Jude. But I want to focus our time in this video really on 1st, 2nd, and a little bit of 3rd John. Because this false teaching really clarifies what John is writing to. Now, John, as a reminder, this is the disciple John that knew and walked with Jesus. And so he is writing to this community of believers when he's an old man. He's probably in his possibly 90s. And so he cares deeply for these believers. So he writes some of these letters. Now, what we find in 1 John, and this book kind of can drive pastors crazy as they're trying to map out their sermons because it's a very circular letter. He keeps coming back to the same topics over and over again and kind of building on them as he goes. And so what he keeps talking about is the incarnation of Jesus, that Jesus is fully God and fully man. He speaks of believers loving one another, that we're to love our brothers and sisters in the faith. And then also he speaks of sin. He says in this life we're not going to be sinless, but yet we're to sin less. We're to not sin as much. We're to go longer stretches with some of those particular sins that we battle in this life. And that gives us some real insight into the false teachers. What we find in chapter 2 is that there were a group of people that were in this community of believers, but they've now left. And these are the false teachers. And so it appears that they are talking about Jesus in a sense of the incarnation did not happen, that Jesus is not fully God and fully man. These false teachers weren't loving those in need. And then it appears that maybe they were even arguing that they were sinless, that they had no sin in their own life. And so this is why John keeps coming back to these issues over and over and over again. And what is so relevant is these false teachers, what they said about Jesus and his divine nature and his human nature still applies today. If you look at all the different false religions, if you kind of just narrow it down, it always comes back to the person of Jesus. Is he fully God? Is he fully man? Now, when we get to 2 John, he is writing, again, talking about these false teachers. And we get to this verse in verse 10, and he says, hey, don't welcome this false teaching, these false teachers into your home. Now, you may hear that and think, okay, if somebody, is kind of walking my neighborhood, right, the guys in the suits, and they're knocking on your door, should you welcome them in? Or you may even ask, hey, should I have non-believing friends? Can I invite them to my home? Well, I hope as Christians that we have non-Christian friends. It's so easy as we go along in our faith, our kind of bubble happens, if you will, of just having Christian friends. And so I would encourage you to develop relationships with unbelievers. That may be through activities that your kids have at school, or maybe your grandkids where you develop relationships at work. And so develop those relationships not to treat somebody that doesn't know Christ as some little project, but because you love them, you care for them, and you want to share your faith. And so invite them into your home. That's a wonderful way to get to know them better. But what John is speaking to here is don't invite false teaching into the home, and we need to clarify what he means by home. These were house churches, okay? So it wasn't the setup that we have today. So to put it more in our context, it would be inviting a false teacher into our church and giving them a platform, maybe in a Sunday school class or some type of small group that takes place in the church. And really the main place would be to let them, teach from the stage, to give a sermon. And John is saying, do not allow this to happen. Guard against this. Now, when we get to 3 John, it kind of flips a little bit. And again, John's writing about these false teachers, and he's saying, hey, be aware of the false teachers, but yet true teachers, these itinerant preachers that are going around, welcome them into your home, okay? Don't disregard them. And so hopefully that gives you a little clarity on 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Again, 2nd and 3rd John are books that we often don't read. I imagine you probably not heard too much teaching or a sermon on that. And so again, I hope that clarifies those wonderful books. And so as we end, I want to kind of come back to the main point. As believers, we're going to face a certain degree of hostility and persecution. That may grow in our culture. And so again, go to 1 Peter, read that wonderful book of how you are to live out your faith. And then the other thing is we need to always be on guard against false teaching. And so this is why I've loved this reading plan this past year, that we are getting exposed to God's Word. We are understanding it better. And so we can disagree on some of the minor issues, such as the end times, when Christ comes back, what all is that going to look like? But the core issues of the faith, the core doctrine, we need to grow in that and understand that better and better so that we can recognize false teaching when it comes up.